I struggled to make last week's podcast, the podcast on transgender athletes and competing in the women's category. With all the work I had done to prepare for it, I felt like I had more questions than answers. I didn't even touch on some aspects of the topic because I didn't feel comfortable. I struggled to figure out how I wanted to say what I want to say, how to keep things concise, and what my answer was. Because I had more questions than answers, by the end, I was not sure, and I had to step away from the podcast for a while, work through things, recognize what the questions were, and with the information we had, where was my answer gonna be, things like that. And I was explaining this to a friend who said to me that I should share my process of how I went through that, of how I what were those questions and how did I come to my answers as helpful because we all go through that as we're learning new things and figuring it out and especially when we don't have the answers to everything. How do we come up with that inclusivity stance when we lack some information? So that's what I'm going to do today. I will share with you what made that podcast so difficult for me and how I worked through it. So, the first thing on the topic of just looking at athletes in general is the policing of women's bodies that goes on, the questioning the physique, the musculature, but the questioning of is there an unfair advantage? But the questioning always goes to gender. Is this person a man? Or sometimes to biological characteristics, is this person male in some sort of way? For me, that is a real issue. We don't see the same thing in the men's category. We don't go, well, that person's really musculature. I wonder what's going on. I'm wondering what kind of advantage there is. And this is to me the problem of using these gender terms for biological characteristics, of saying, "Oh, this kind of build is masculine." And I think we are so caught up on it in women, and we want to know when somebody excels in their sport as a woman, what makes it different? Why is it different? And we're do it in very critiquing way. I will say it's a very human response that when something turns out different than when we expect, especially if we consider that different result a problem, then we have a tendency to want answers and we look for things. We look for associations. What is different? And so what we're doing is we're looking for difference in physicality because that's what we can see. We're looking for differences so we can make sense of it in our brain. This is a very human thing. What are the chromosomes? What's the hormones? That must be it when we don't know if that's it or not, right? There's an association here. And why do we do this for women and not men? When men have a very different physicality from their other competitors, when men are performing at way higher levels and breaking world records than their competitors, we are never questioning their physicality. We're not policing their bodies. We're not going, wait a second, does this person have an unfair advantage over other people? We treat the men and women differently. The other thing I struggled with is why do we treat these differences, these physical differences in women and question and police them, but we don't have an issue with other body differences? Let me give you some examples. If I say picture a basketball player, go ahead and picture a basketball player, professional. I'm guessing that you did not picture somebody under 6 feet tall, right? Not that there aren't professional basketball players under 6 feet tall, but I think we can probably count them with our fingers. And probably the number we could name off the top of our heads, we could probably count with one hand. The point is that we accept that basketball players are going to be taller. We're not saying that's not fair. I mean, I personally would love to see I love basketball, by the way. I would love to see a league for under 6 foot players because the game would be played differently, right? So I digress. But we know that for that. for basketball players, and we don't say, "Wait, that's unfair." We just say, like, "That's the way it goes." Like, if you're taller, you're more likely to be able to play, right? Let me give you another example. Picture a long distance Olympic runner, like marathon runner. Go ahead and picture them. I'm guessing you're not picturing anybody short and stocky. I'm guessing you're not picturing anybody super muscular, right? We tend to think of those marathon runners as long and wafy, long-limbed, slender, right? And and we don't know, is the training for that sport what creates that? Is it their genetics that create that and then make them more likely to do that sport? Who knows? But we don't have a problem be like, "Hey, wait a second. That's not fair. You're long and wafy." Those of us that were built more solid, never gonna have a chance to do that. We accept that. So why is this different? And the only thing I can point to is it's associated with gender, whether rightfully or not, that certain physicalities are associated with a gender, which again goes back to me the problem of having this generic category that is not clearly defined. So I struggle with the policing of women's bodies, of these differences, of the critiquing and examining, and then trying to hang our hat on something that makes it different. That brings me to the next thing because if we police the physicality of women's bodies and they don't have elevated testosterone and they don't have XY chromosomes, then we're willing to step away from it a bit with a little bit of disgruntledness and continued questioning and maybe the tests aren't right and all that kind of stuff. But even hanging the hats on the chromosomes and testosterone, we don't even know. And so that came to my next issue is that we're not sure what role testosterone plays. We're hanging our hat on it because, again, it's something different. We're hanging our hat on it because we have such an issue with men versus women. And I'll get to that point a little bit more, but we have such an issue with that that anything associated with men is must be what makes it unfair. And so there's so much that we don't know about testosterone because the way we talk about it in women is that the more testosterone, the greater the performance. But we're not sure exactly how that's true, if that's true, and how it varies in various bodies. What I mean is, if that were true, that the more testosterone, the greater the performance, then we should see that in some of these top athletes in men too. I would love for us to do a study where we tested all the elite athletes, those willing to participate. I believe it should be consensual, but all the elite athletes and look at their testosterone levels and look at their performance. That's something that has not been done. Is there a correlation between testosterone level and performance? Those that are getting the gold, do they have higher testosterone levels? Because that's the way we talk about it as if we know, but we actually don't know if that's the case. We don't know what role testosterone plays and if that's really the difference in performance. Like I think about from these last Olympics, Leon Marchand, who won 4 gold medals and broke Michael Phelps' world record in the 400-meter individual medley. And he broke it by over a second. I think it's 1.34 seconds. He broke Michael Phelps' world record. And in swimming, especially for that, a second, much less over a second, is significant improvement. But nobody was like, hold on a second. How'd he do that? Let's test him. Let's test his testosterone. Let's test his oxygen carrying capacity. We don't do that. And I kind of curious why not? Because appropriately so, we don't allow people to dope and compete, right? And one part of doping is testosterone. Sometimes people dope with testosterone and we think that's not fair. If it occurs naturally in the men, it's okay. But why is that? Why is it if we believe testosterone creates an unfair advantage, why aren't we testing everyone, including these top athletes, It's because we don't know. I would love to do the study where we test all biological sexes, meaning male, female, and intersex. Might even have to break it down further and look at each of those athletes' testosterone levels and their performance. But we don't do that. So we need more evidence. And I think what really called me into question, well, a lot of things called me into question, but really called me into question that we hang our hats so much on testosterone, I'm not so sure, was the study of the elite athletes that we have so far looking from sport to sport, looking at male competitors in different sports and female competitors in different sports and their various hormone levels. And it's like the first study that showed so low, hypoandrogenism in the male athletes, meaning low levels of testosterone in these elite athletes. They found that the power lifters tend to have the lowest levels of testosterone. Think about that. Think about how you'd picture a power lifter. Now, would you expect them to have the lowest levels of testosterone? The other thing they found is in the male track and field athletes, they tended to have higher levels of estradiol, a form of estrogen, and prolactin. This study leads us to ask a lot more questions. Now, we don't know if those hormone differences are a result of training or if those hormone differences are inherent to the athlete, and maybe those differences allow them to do better in these sports, excel in these sports, and take them down this pathway. We don't know. And all this demonstrates is a lot more questions that we don't know, that we keep hanging our hat on with such certainty, something like testosterone, when we don't actually know its role and how much and in what ways. And even how we assume that testosterone is going to act the same in all bodies. What I mean is, we say, oh, well, testosterone in a body that is intersex. And I want to be clear, intersex is a biological sex category. That's what intersex is. It's not a gender, it's a biological sex category. It is bodies that biological characteristics don't fit in all four categories of the female or all four categories of the male category. You can go back and listen to episode 2 to learn more about that. But anyway, those bodies develop differently. Their biology develops differently. DSD, differences in sexual differentiation. And so to assume that testosterone acts the same, I think is a big assumption that needs information and data. I'll give you the example of hearts. Everyone has a heart, so does that mean it acts acts the same no matter what? For years, we taught people the signs of cardiac arrest based on all studies done on males because it's a heart, right? Heart's a heart, acts the same way, right? But we found out, because we did not study outside men, that when we started studying more than just males, that the signs of a heart attack are different for females. There are different symptoms for females. And that is because there's so many factors in biology that we don't know. And so this is what I mean, just because a heart is in all bodies, without looking at the other factors, without researching and studying, we don't know that it acts the same. The same with testosterone. We don't know how testosterone acts the same or differently in different bodies with different biologies. So, as I pointed out before, there just leads to so many more questions than answers that I don't always feel like we can hang our hat on testosterone. Is there some difference? Yes. But again, it's an association. It's not clear what there is. And then the third part I struggled with was learning. And if you haven't listened to the podcast series Tested, it's all about the athletes that fall under the DSD category in the Olympics and what they have been through in the history of it and the eligibility requirements and the fights they have gone through to be able to compete. I was willing to think about a testosterone level to suppress under for if we're going to categorize males and females, then I was willing to say, okay, let's suppress testosterone below a certain level. But learning about the athletes that are categorized as DSD really created pause for me because it made me realize they were asking these athletes to suppress their testosterone not for medical reasons, but in order to be able to compete. And I have a real problem with that. I have a real problem doing a medical intervention without a medical reason. It just waves a red flag that there's some problem here, that there's something. These are women. And if they do not have a reason and they don't feel the need for intervention to be themselves for their health, all aspects of their health, then to intervene to be able to compete as their true selves, I have a real problem. It also made me start to think of the argument of checking testosterone levels and making sure they're suppressed in order to, quote, be fair. It made me think of the transgender women athletes. Does every transgender woman want testosterone suppression? I don't believe there are any always and nevers. So I believe I'm sure there are transgender women that don't want testosterone suppression. And if they don't, does that make them any less of a woman? I don't think so. And then there's the question of, are there transgender women that want testosterone suppression that don't have access to that medical care, that can't afford that medical care? It creates a huge, huge problem for me. And I went into it thinking, yeah, we should suppress testosterone below a certain level. And in the end, if you listen to last week's podcast, I did end up coming to a level and proposing that, but I don't think that's the best answer. I don't know what it is. And then the final issue, the fourth issue I really struggled with is recognizing the difference, the significant difference in times when it comes to sports like track and swimming, of the way the categories are now of male and female, recognizing that the gold medal winners, the gold medal times in the women's category in swimming and in track would not even qualify for the males to be able to compete in the male category. So, for example, I think the 1500-meter freestyle swim, the gold medalist time was about 25 to 30 seconds slower than the qualifying time for men, meaning that if we did not have the division the way we have it now, we wouldn't have seen any women in the competition. Any women, not any females, any women. I don't think we'd see transgender female athletes. We wouldn't see women who fall under the DSD category. We wouldn't see any women competing based on that. And so there is a difference, and I do like seeing the various representation. But I think it left me with this question. One, does that difference matter? Again, thinking about the goals of sports. One, when does it matter? You say, oh, it matters right away. We know before puberty it doesn't matter. And then between middle school and high school, when puberty is undergoing, people are undergoing it at different rates. I had a friend of mine whose boys played lacrosse, and she was telling me in high school, it was very interesting because sometimes it would look like there were these grown men out there and there were these young boys, like little things out there too, and they were competing against each other. And if we think that there is some safety issue with size and things like that, then that's how we should be dividing it up. But in middle school and high school, there's such a variety of development and differences that it's not an uncommon story to hear people talk about athletics in those levels and say, oh, this was a big team or this was a really small team. And we accept that. Why? Because I think the goals of athletics are a little bit different. We encourage and we want more people to participate. There are a lot of high schools that have a no cut policy. or a limited cut policy because the goals are different. So, at what level do the differences that we don't even know what creates those differences? When does it matter? When does it matter that we need to say this is too unfair and we need to start monitoring it? I think it's a real difficult question to answer. And when is that difference most pronounced? Is it even that pronounced uh, in high school and in college? I think some of you would say yes, but there are a lot of differences team to team that are more pronounced. There's a lot of differences between Division 1 and Division 3. If you put a Division 1 team against Division 3, there's a reason we have those divisions. They're different. So, like I said, it left me with so many more questions, especially not knowing what creates those differences between those categories. So, not knowing how to monitor for it. And we're just doing it in this generic way of males and females, but we don't know. And the problem with the way that we're doing it is calling into question some of these things I said, policing bodies. It's calling women who are women, calling them men. And we haven't even talked about the non binary athletes. The non binary athletes are forced to choose a category that they don't identify with. So, this question, it's complex. This question leads to so many more questions and recognition of so many things we don't understand. So it makes sense. If I'm struggling, if you're struggling, if we are struggling with this question, it also makes sense that most of us have hung our hat on the system that is there as if this is fair before we've ever looked to think of it in other ways and see all the people it affects. And so I think many of you that are listening either very much disagree or you are a believer in inclusivity, and that's probably more likely who you are, and you're struggling. And I just want to say the struggle makes sense, and hopefully listening to this makes sense. So at the end of the day, the conclusion I came up with of no testing until it's at the professional elite level, testing testosterone to keep it under 10 nanomoles per liter. Why? Because that's the lower limit of the male. And right now it's at 2.5, which tends to be the higher limit of the female level. But the thing is, 10 to 2.5 is a gray area. And I think there are a lot of questions in not knowing what that advantage is or anything. That's why I left it at that. But at the end of the day, if we're going to call it a women's category, then women should be able to compete. Women that are intersex, women that are transgender. In my opinion, they should be able to compete. And here's the last thing I want to say, and I know I said it last week, but I think it's important to say again, is if we do not allow transgender athletes to compete, we will never get the data. I mentioned last week that we have one transgender woman ever compete in the Olympics. We only have a sprinkling in other higher levels of competition. We don't have much data. So, if you struggled, it makes sense. And I'm hoping this drives us that until we know more, to be more inclusive than exclusive, to remember the goals of competition and to encourage us, to motivate us, to inspire us to get more data. Have a great week.